Hi, this is Guy Burgess. In this Moving Beyond Intractability seminar post, I'd like to follow up on an argument that I made in an earlier post. That is that intractable conflict is as serious a threat to human society as climate change. And one way to understand why this is true is to go back to a book written in the 1970s, The Limits to Growth. And The Limits to Growth made an argument that society was facing overshoot and collapse because of a range of, well, basically because of two major trends. One is that it argued that society is dependent upon a fixed stock of natural resources, and that those resources were rapidly being depleted. And as they're depleted, the cost goes up. The drag that the cost of those resources places on industrial output and food production would increase, ultimately to the point that it caused a collapse in industrial output and food production that would be followed by a collapse in population. And just the general sort of misery that we're talking about when we talk about climate change disasters. The other big driving thing behind the limits to growth scenario was population. Certainly as population continued to grow, based in large part on the resources that it was depleting, that would place ever more demand on those resources, further compounding things. At any rate, the ultimate dismal prediction was industrial output, population, and food would ultimately collapse, and that's what folks were trying to figure out how to avoid. And this led to books like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, that basically made the argument that the population of humanity is growing so fast that we're going to outrun the resource base and we're going to collapse, and really the only alternative was to find ways of reducing population growth. The counter-argument was mounted by a guy named Julian Simon, and he argued that humans are the ultimate resource and that we don't really face a natural resource limit. Simon put his faith in Adam Smith and the invisible hand of the market that would create and always create enormous incentives for folks who could produce natural resources less expensively, even in the face of diminishing supplies from sort of currently exploited fields, but also find substitutes, way of doing the things that we want to do with those resources less expensively using completely different resources. And this led the two guys to make a very famous bet. Simon and Ehrlich picked a package of natural resources that they thought was typical of the resource base upon which society depended. And if I recall correctly, they bet 10 years out. Simon bet that the cost of those resources, adjusting for inflation and all that, would actually drop. And Ehrlich bet that no, the prices would go way up because we were running into the resource limits. And the truth is that in this case, Simon won and Ehrlich lost. And fast forwarding that was the 10-year period there was in the 80s and 90s. In the early 2000s, we thought, hey, we're running into these limits again, this time in oil. And there were books like The Age of Tough Oil and Wake Up, This is Peak Oil, and pretty soon we're going to start running out of things and terrible things are going to happen. And then they invented fracking. And what do you know? We have more oil than we know what to do with, and world oil prices are plummeting. So this suggests a change to the original Club of Rome graph. Instead of having resources collapsing, we may well have, at least when you adjust for substitutions and all of that, the prospects for a continuing increase in resources. So then you say, wow, hey, there are no limits to growth. There is no overshoot and collapse. The free market fixes all. We're fine. We don't have to worry, right? And this has been reflected in trust in the markets, which is a widespread political phenomenon now where people say the government needs to just get out, let the markets do their thing and everything will be all right. And Ayn Rand here is, of course, the poster child for the sort of unlimited market philosophy. But unfortunately, there's some issues here. Certainly, if you remove the resource limit, then industrial output, food, and population is going to continue to grow with no obvious limits in sight. So again, do we have a limitless future? And the problem was that there was another little graph on this. There's a pollution one down here at the bottom, and on this graph, for reasons that I don't quite understand, it's a little hard to see, but the green line is pollution. As if if you don't have resource limits and population, everything just keeps going, then the pollution burden on the planet tends to increase, and you run the risk of a tragedy of the commons. And that, again, go back to the original Club of Rome thing, you can see that pollution comes up, and that also starts crashing, but pollution can become the major drag on, or the real limit to growth, and that's what we're trying to find some way to deal with. So in a sense, the real limits to growth is not the ability to produce more resources. Markets do take care of that. And one of the other things that's important to understand is that that's a very simple organizational process, that basically markets are transactions between willing buyers and willing sellers. It doesn't take any large-scale collaboration, agreement, cooperation. It's just buyers and sellers. I want something. Can you get it to me for cheaper? Even giant corporations are basically networks of willing buyers and willing sellers. The problem with the tragedies of the commons is that they're tragedies that arise when lots of willing buyer, willing seller interactions wind up depleting the commons on which everyone depends. In Garrett Hardin's original formulation, the incentive is for everybody to graze more sheep on the commons till you overgraze it and it collapses and all the sheep herds die. We saw this in the American West. If you wondered why there's sagebrush everywhere, is because we overgrazed the American West. There was a big drought. The giant cattle herds of the 1870s collapsed, and the only thing they wouldn't eat, they'd rather die first, is sagebrush. So in a sense, the real challenge and the real limit to growth is how we avoid tragedies of the commons like this. Now, obviously, climate change is such a tragedy of the commons, but there are a bunch of other planetary boundaries that we may be crossing. And the big thing here is that we've got to find ways of addressing all this. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about protecting the commons, there's two philosophic perspectives on this. There's the sort of hardcore environmental perspective, maybe best exemplified by Earth First, which is a pretty extreme group getting precariously close to eco-terrorism, but their motto is no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. And they see human society as a cancer growing on the planet, and their idea of protecting the commons is to protect the commons from people. And understandably, lots of people don't think that's such a good idea. You certainly can't build a big coalition behind that. On the other hand, folks like the Human Security Working Group focus on protecting the commons for people. And that's what we really need to do. And the commons isn't just the environment. It is the global financial system. It is the global trade system. It's a wide range of social and cultural and security systems that we depend upon in order for society to continue to operate. Now, the key feature of protecting the commons and preventing the invisible hand from turning into what Kenneth Boulding calls an invisible fist. This is, when the pursuit of self-interest winds up producing tragedies of the commons that hurt everybody, then that's the invisible fist. And you've got to somehow find a mechanism for balancing the competing interests of the entire society in a ways that protect the commons. So what this does is it raises the management of the commons as the sort of ultimate intractable conflict problem. That first of all, it has to operate on the scale of billions of people. So it's not a bilateral buyer-willing seller interaction. The protecting the commons is something that we have to do now at the scale of 7 billion people. And that requires a cooperative effort at a level that humans have never been able to do before. The other thing to understand is there's multitudes of independent actors, each with very limited influence, each trying to do their own thing with a certain amount of altruism. You're talking about protecting the commons when the impacts of protecting the commons are really long-term, beyond the terms of office of key decision makers, in fact, beyond their lifetimes. There's still selfish Machiavellian actors. There's the fact that humans engage in an awful lot of non-rational decision-making. There's limited biased information. There's all sorts of technical complexity and, of course, chaos. It's clear we got to get a whole lot better at dealing with all of these problems. And what we just want to start exploring is what is it really going to take to do that?